A huge man-killing machine. That's what the famous author and journalist Jack London called the 20th century slums of London's East End. In 1902, Jack visited his namesake city to report on the coronation of the new king, Edward VII, from the perspective of the poor and destitute. What he reported caused a national scandal. Britain's imperial dominance was at its height, and on paper the country was doing well. But just out of sight, a city of 500,000 was slowly starving to death on the streets. A huge man-killing machine is honestly quite an apt description of what London was like at the turn of the 20th century. While previous sanitary reforms and infrastructure had improved the lives of the more well-to-do, the urban poor were caught in a trap from which escape was virtually impossible. Rents were up, wages were down, and work, even for skilled labourers, was hard to come by. Getting sick or injured without substantial savings banked up meant you'd end up on the street. Food, if you could afford it, was nutritionally deficient, and anti-vagrancy laws meant that sleeping outside was forbidden. If you were caught napping after dark, the police would wake you up and force you to move along, or face a beating. Exhausted and starving men are no good for manual labour, and so finding any work became virtually impossible. There were workhouses, but, as we shall hear, you had to be really lucky to get inside. The system ground people down and killed them off by hunger or with disease. Nevertheless, more working-class men and women poured into the city from the countryside in search of jobs and a shot at a better life. Without the newcomers, London's poor would probably have died out, but those who died on the streets were easily and quickly replaced. Into this maelstrom of despair came Jack London, a self-taught American who knew what hard work was and had heard tell of London's so-called abyss. Against all good advice, he decided to see it for himself. He kitted himself out as one of the city's many hundreds of stranded American sailors and lived undercover in the slums for 2 months. Today, academics would probably call him an ethnographer engaging in participant observation, but Jack saw himself simply as a man out to expose a terrible truth. These are his words, and the words of those he survived alongside in the slums of London. Nowhere in the streets of London may one escape the sight of abject poverty. 5 minutes from any point will bring one to a slum, but the region my hansom was now penetrating was one unending slum. The streets were filled with a new and different race of people, short of stature and of wretched or beer-sodden appearance. We rolled along the miles of bricks and squalor, and from each cross street and alley flashed long vistas of bricks and misery. Here and there lurched a drunken man or woman, and the air was obscene with sounds of jangling and squabbling. At a market, tottery old men and women were searching in the garbage thrown in the mud for rotten potatoes, beans and vegetables, while little children clustered like flies around a festering mass of fruit, thrusting their arms to the shoulders into the liquid corruption and drawing forth morsels, but partially decayed, which they devoured on the spot. Jack made a number of friends during his stay in the East End, one of which was a worker in a sweatshop that made cheap shoes. The man was delighted to meet a foreigner and took Jack to see his workplace, in exchange for a mug of ale. "I'm a hearty man," he announced. "Not like the other chaps at my shop, I ain't. They consider me a fine specimen of manhood. Why, do you know I weigh 10 stone? His skin was an unhealthy colour, body gnarled and twisted out of all decency, contracted chest, shoulders bent prodigiously from long hours of toil, and head hanging heavily forward and out of place. How tall are you?" 5'2", he answered proudly. "And the chaps at the shop—" "Let me see the shop," I said. The shop was idle just then, but I still desired to see it. Passing Lehman Street, we cut off to the left into Spitalfields and dived into Frying Pan Alley. A spawn of children cluttered the slimy pavement, for all the world like tadpoles just turned frogs on the bottom of a dry pond. In a narrow doorway, so narrow that perforce we stepped over her, sat a woman with a young babe. nursing at breasts grossly naked and libelling all the sacredness of motherhood. In the black and narrow hall behind her we waded through a mess of young life, and essayed an even narrower and fouler stairway. Up we went 3 flights, each landing 2 feet by 3 in area, and heaped with filth and refuse. There were 7 rooms in this abomination called a house. In 6 of the rooms, 20-odd people of both sexes and all ages cooked, ate, slept, and worked. In size, the rooms averaged 8 feet by 8, or possibly 9. The 7th room we entered, it was the den in which 5 men sweated. It was 7 feet wide by 8 long, and the table at which the work was performed took up the major portion of the space. On this table were 5 lasts, and there was barely room for the men to stand to their work, for the rest of the space was heaped with cardboard, leather, bundles of shoe uppers, and a miscellaneous assortment of materials used in attaching the uppers of shoes to their soles. In the adjoining room lived a woman and 6 children. In another vile hole lived a widow, with an only son of 16 who was dying of consumption. The woman hawked sweetmeats on the street, I was told, and more often than not failed to supply her son with the 3 quarts of milk he required daily. Further, this son, weak and dying, did not taste meat oftener than once a week, and the kind and quality of this meat cannot possibly be imagined. "The way he coughs is something terrible," volunteered my sweated friend, referring to the dying boy. "We hear him in here while we're working, and it's terrible, I say, terrible." I found another menace added to the hostile environment of the children of the slum. My sweated friend, when work was to be had, toiled with 4 other men in his 8 by 7 room. In good times, when there was a rush of work, they worked 12, 13 and 14 hours a day, just as fast as they could. "And you should see us sweat, just running from us. If you could see us, it'd dazzle your eyes. Tacks flying out of mouth like from a machine. Look at my mouth." I looked. The teeth were worn down by the constant friction of the metallic brads, while they were coal black and rotten. "I clean my teeth," he added, "else they'd be worse." And yet I was given to understand this was one of the better grades of sweating. I looked out of the window, which should have commanded a view of the backyards of the neighbouring buildings, but there was no backyards, or rather, they were covered with 1-story hovels, cowsheds, in which people lived. The roofs of these hovels were covered with the deposits of filth, in some places a couple of feet deep, the contributions from the back windows of the 2nd and 3rd stories. I could make out fish and meat bones, garbage, pestilential rags, old boots, broken earthenware, and all the general refuse of a human sty. "This is the last year of this trade. They're getting machines to do away with us," said the sweated one mournfully, as we stepped over the woman with the breasts grossly naked and waded anew through the cheap young life. Jack later made his way to Spitalfield Gardens, one of the few places in which the out of work could rest during the day. He was appalled all over again by what he saw. The shadow of Christ Church falls across Spitalfield's garden, and in the shadow of Christ Church, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I saw a sight I never wish to see again. There are no flowers in this garden. Grass only grows here, and it is surrounded by a sharp, spiked iron fence, as are all the parks of London town, so that homeless men and women may not come in at night and sleep upon it. We went up the narrow gravelled walk. On the benches on either side arrayed a mass of miserable and distorted humanity. It was a welter of rags and filth, of all manner of loathsome skin diseases, open sores, bruises, grossness, indecency, leering monstrosities, and bestial faces. A chill, raw wind was blowing, and these creatures huddled there in their rags, sleeping for the most part, or trying to sleep. Here were a dozen women, ranging in age from 20 years to 70. Next, a babe, possibly of 9 months, lying asleep, flat on the hard bench, with neither pillow nor covering, nor with anyone looking after it. Next, half a dozen men, sleeping bolt upright or leaning against one another in their sleep. In one place, a family group, a child asleep in its sleeping mother's arms, and the husband, or male mate, clumsily mending a dilapidated shoe. On another bench, a woman trimming the frayed strips of her rags with a knife, and another woman, with thread and needle, sewing up rents. Adjoining, a man holding a sleeping woman in his arms. Farther on, a man, his clothing caked with gutter mud, asleep, with head in the lap of a woman not more than 25 years old, and also asleep. It was this sleeping that puzzled me. Why were 9 out of 10 of them asleep or trying to sleep? But it was not till afterwards that I learned it is a law of the powers that be that the homeless shall not sleep by night. On the pavement by the portico of Christ Church, where the stone pillars rise toward the sky in a stately row, were whole rows of men lying asleep or drowsing, and all too deep sunk in torpor to rouse or to be made curious by our intrusion. A lung of London, I said. Nay, an abscess, a great putrescent sore. Those women there, said our guide, will sell themselves for a loaf of stale bread. He said it with a cheerful sneer. The government's answer to the unemployment crisis in London was workhouses. These were the factories that took people in off the street, fed them, washed them, and gave them a place to rest. In return, the recipients of this charity had to put in a gruelling day's labour. Not all workhouses in England were as harsh as those in Whitechapel, where Jack made his observations, but the excess supply of desperate workers in that part of the city meant the workhouse owner could increase work hours and decrease living standards as he wished. Even so, just getting inside a workhouse was a challenge. As Jack explains, I have found that it is not easy to get into the casual ward of a workhouse. I have made 2 attempts now, and I shall shortly make a 3rd. The first time I started out at 7 o'clock in the evening with 4 shillings in my pocket. Herein I committed 2 errors. In the first place, the applicant for admission to the casual ward must be destitute, and he is subject to a rigorous search. He must really be destitute, and 4pence, much less 4 shillings, is sufficient affluence to disqualify him. In the second place, I made the mistake of tardiness. 7 o'clock in the evening is too late in the day for a pauper to get a pauper's bed. For the benefit of gently nurtured and innocent folk, let me explain what a casual ward is. It is a building where the homeless, bedless, penniless man, if he be lucky, may casually rest his weary bones, and then work like a navvy the next day to pay for it. My second attempt to break into the casual ward began more auspiciously. I started in the middle of the afternoon, accompanied by 2 mates, and all I had in my pocket was 3pence. They piloted me to Whitechapel Workhouse, at which I peered from around a friendly corner. It was a few minutes past 5 in the afternoon, but already a long and melancholy line was formed, which strung out around the corner of the building and out of sight. It was a most woeful picture. Men and women waiting in the cold grey end of day for a pauper's shelter from the night. How many more do they want? 24, came the answer. We looked ahead anxiously and counted. 34 were ahead of us. Disappointment and consternation dawned upon the faces about me. It is not a nice thing, hungry and penniless, to face a sleepless night in the streets. But we hoped against hope, till, when 10 stood outside the wicket, the porter turned us away. Full up, that was all he said, as he banged the door. I stood and debated with 2 other men, wise in the knowledge of casual wards, as to where we should go. They decided on the Poplar Workhouse, 3 miles away, and we started off. The carter, with his clean-cut face, chin beard and shaved upper lip, I should have taken in the United States for anything from a master workman to a well-to-do farmer. The carpenter, well, I should have taken him for a carpenter. He looked it, clean and wiry, with shrewd, observant eyes and hands that had grown twisted to the handles of tools through 47 years' work at the trade. The chief difficulty with these men was that they were old, and their children, instead of growing up to take care of them, had died. Their years had told on them, and they had been forced out of the whirl of industry by the younger and stronger competitors who had taken their places. With these 2 men, turned away from a casual ward of Whitechapel Workhouse, were bound with me for Poplar Workhouse. Not much of a show, they thought, but to chance it was all that remained to us. It was Poplar, or the streets and the night. Both men were anxious for a bed, for they were about gone, as they phrased it. The carter, 58 years of age, had spent the last 3 nights without shelter or sleep, while the carpenter, 65 years of age, had been out 5 nights. But, oh dear soft people, full of meat and blood, with white sheets and airy rooms waiting you each night, how can I make you know what it is to suffer as you would suffer if you spent a weary night on London's streets. Believe me, you would think 1,000 centuries had come and gone before the east paled into dawn. You would shiver till you were ready to cry aloud with the pain of each aching muscle, and you would marvel that you could endure so much and live. Should you rest upon a bench and your tired eyes close, depend upon it that a policeman would rouse you and gruffly order you to move on. You may rest upon the bench, and benches are few and far between, but if rest means sleep, on you must go, dragging your tired body through the endless streets. Should you, in desperate slyness, seek some forlorn alley or dark passageway and lie down, the omnipresent policeman will rout you out all the same. It is his business to rout you out. It is a law of the powers that be that you shall be routed out. For old men of 60, 70 and 80, ill-fed with neither meat nor blood, to greet the dawn unrefreshed and to stagger through the day in mad search for crusts, with relentless night rushing down upon them, and to do this 5 nights and days? Both kept their eyes upon the pavement as they walked and talked, and every now and then one or the other would stoop and pick something up, never missing the stride the while. I thought it was a cigar or cigarette stumps they were collecting, and for some time took no notice. Then I did notice. From the slimy, spittle-drenched side wall they were picking up bits of orange peel, apple skin, and grape stems, and they were eating them. The pits of green-gauge plums they cracked between their teeth for the kernels inside, picked up stray crumbs of bread the size of peas, apple cores so black and dirty one would not take them to be apple cores. And these things these 2 men took into their mouths, and chewed them, and swallowed them. And this, between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening of August 20, the year of our Lord 1902, in the heart of the greatest, wealthiest, and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. These 2 men talked. They were not fools, they were merely old, and, naturally, their guts reek with pavement offal. They talked of criminality. Actually make a man a criminal against his will, said the carpenter. Here I am, old, younger men taking me place, my clothes getting shabbier and shabbier, and making it harder every day to get a job. I go to the casual ward for a bed, must be there by 2 or 3 in the afternoon, or I won't get in. You saw what happened today. What chance does that give me to look for work? Suppose I do get into the casual ward. Keep me in all day tomorrow, let me out morning or next day. What then? The law says I can't get in another casual ward that night less than 10 miles distant. Have to hurry and walk to be there in time that day. What chance does that give me to look for a job? Suppose I don't walk. Suppose I look for a job. In no time there's nights come and no bed. No sleep all night, nothing to eat. What shape am I in the morning to look for work? Got to make up my sleep in the park somehow and get something to eat. And there I am, old, down, and no chance to get up. After a walk of 3 miles, the men arrived at the Poplar Workhouse. Here, Jack showed his naivete and saw what happens when one man has the smallest bit of power over desperate men. On one side the door was a bell handle, on the other side a press button. "Ring the bell," said the carter to me. And just as I ordinarily would at anyone's door, I pulled out the handle and rang a peal. "Oh, oh," they cried in one terrified voice. "Not so hard." I let go, and they looked reproachfully at me, as though I had imperilled their chance for a bed and 3 parts of skilly. Nobody came. Luckily, it was the wrong bell, and I felt better. "Press the button," I said to the carpenter. No, wait a bit," the carter hurriedly interposed, from all of which I drew the conclusion that a poorhouse porter, who commonly draws a yearly salary of from £7 to £9, is a very finicky and important personage, and cannot be treated too fastidiously by paupers. So we waited, 10 times a decent interval, when the carter stealthily advanced a timid forefinger to the button and gave it the faintest, shortest possible push. I have looked at waiting men where life or death was in the issue, but anxious suspense showed less plainly on their faces than it showed on the faces of these 2 men as they waited on the coming of the porter. He came. He barely looked at us. "Full up," he said, and shut the door. "Another night of it," groaned the carpenter. In the dim light, the carter looked grey. The workhouse full up, Jack and the men had to sleep rough, but even that had its own challenges. Now, Consider that you are a poor young man, penniless in London town, and that tomorrow you must look for work. It is necessary, therefore, that you get some sleep in order that you may have the strength to look for work, and to do work in case you find it. So I sat down on the stone steps of a building. 5 minutes later, a policeman was looking at me. My eyes were wide open, so he only grunted and passed on. 10 minutes later, my head was on my knees. I was dozing, and that same policeman was saying gruffly, "Here you, get out of that." I got, and I continued to get. For every time I dozed, a policeman was there to rout me along again. Not long after, when I had given this up, I was walking with a young Londoner when I noticed an open passage leading under a building and disappearing in darkness. A low iron gate barred the entrance. "Come on," I said. "Let's climb over and get a good sleep." "What?" he answered, recoiling from me. "And get running for 3 months? Blimey if I do." "I was down under the arches," grumbled another young fellow. By arches, he meant the shore arches where begin the bridges that span the Thames. "I was down under the arches when it was raining its hardest, and a bobby comes in and chases me out. But I come back, and he come back too. 'Here,' says he, 'what you doing here?' And out I goes. But I says, 'Think I want to pinch the bleeding bridge?' And so, dear soft people, should you ever visit London town and see these men asleep on the benches and in the grass, please do not think they are lazy creatures, preferring sleep to work. Know that the powers that be have kept them walking all the night long, and that in the day they have nowhere else to sleep. Here was a motley crowd of woebegone wretches who had spent the night in the rain. Such prodigious misery, and so much of it. Old men, young men, all manner of men, and boys to boot, and all manner of boys. Some were drowsing standing up. 60 of them were stretched out on the stone steps in the most painful of postures, all of them sound asleep, the skin of their bodies showing red through the holes and rents in their rags. And up and down the street and across the street for a block either way, each doorstep had from 2 to 3 occupants, all asleep, their heads bent forward on their knees. And, it must be remembered, these are not hard times in England. Things are going on very much as they ordinarily do, and times are neither hard nor easy. Hearing that the Salvation Army were offering a free breakfast to the poor on Sunday, Jack and a few others spent much of Saturday night walking across Whitechapel to arrive before too long a queue had formed. They got there in the early hours of the morning and were utterly exhausted. Others had come too, and many were falling asleep in doorways and alcoves on the street. And then came the policeman. "Get out of that, you bloomin' swine! Hey, get out now!" And like swine he drove them from doorways and scattered them to the 4 winds of Surrey. But when he encountered the crowd asleep on the steps, he was astounded. "Shocking!" he exclaimed. "Shocking! And of a Sunday morning! Hey, get out of that, you!" The policeman passed on, and back we clustered like flies around a honey jar. For was there not that wonderful thing, a breakfast, awaiting us? We could not have clustered more persistently and desperately had they been giving away $1,000,000 banknotes. Some were already off to sleep when back came the policeman, and away we scattered, only to return again as soon as the coast was clear. Sailors were very plentiful in this crowd. It seemed to me that 1 man in 4 was looking for a ship, and I found at least a dozen of them to be American sailors. In accounting for their being on the beach, I received the same story from each and all, and from my knowledge of sea affairs, this story rang true. English ships sign their sailors for the voyage, which means the round trip, sometimes lasting as long as 3 years, and they cannot sign off and receive their discharges until they reach the home port, which is England. Their wages are low, their food is bad, and their treatment worse. Very often they are really forced by their captains to desert in the New World or in the colonies, leaving a handsome sum of wages behind them. A distinct gain, either to the captain or the ship owners, or to both. But whether for this reason alone or not, it is a fact that large numbers of them desert. Then, for the home voyage, the ship engages whatever sailors it can find on the beach. These men are engaged at the somewhat higher wages that obtain in other portions of the world, under the agreement that they shall sign off on reaching England. The reason for this is obvious, for it would be poor business policy to sign them for any longer time, since seamen's wages are low in England, and England is always crowded with sailormen on the beach, so this fully accounted for the American seamen at the Salvation Army. Several hours later, the doors opened and a legion of starving men tried to enter the hall all at once. A Salvation Army officer corralled them with threats, and again, we shall see what happens when one man has a small amount of power. "Stop this here now, or I'll turn you the other way and march you out, and you'll get no breakfast." I cannot convey by printed speech the insufferable way in which he said this. He seemed to me to revel in that he was a man in authority, able to say to 500,000 ragged wretches, "You may eat or go hungry, as I elect." To deny us our breakfast after standing for hours, it was an awful threat, and the pitiful, abject silence which instantly fell attested its awfulness. And it was a cowardly threat. We could not strike back, for we were starving, and it is the way of the world that when one man feeds another, he is that man's master. Jack got his breakfast, but only after finishing it discovered that it was provided on the condition that he stay for religious service. A staunch atheist, and feeling tricked, Jack confronted the officer who'd let him in. "But it can't be done," the officer said, waxing virtuously indignant at such ingratitude. "The idea!" he snorted. "The very idea!" "Do you mean to say that I can't get out of here?" I demanded. "That you will keep me here against my will?" "Yes," he snorted, and he drew me over to a corner of the room, and then into another room. Here he again demanded my reasons for wishing to go. "I want to go," I said, "because I wish to look for work over in Stepney, and every hour lessens my chance of finding work. It is now 25 minutes to 12. I did not think that when I came in that it would take so long to get a breakfast." "You have business, eh?" he sneered. "A man of business you are, eh? Then what did you come here for?" "I was out all night, and I needed a breakfast in order to strengthen me to find work. That is why I came here." "A nice thing to do," he went on in the same sneering manner. "A man with business shouldn't come here." On discovering he was a foreigner, the Salvation Army commanding officer let Jack go with a warning. Back on the street, he spent the next few days looking for work and found none, even though he was a fit, strong, and literate young man. The next few weeks proceeded in much the same manner, and Jack was compelled to use some emergency money he had squirreled away to buy food, lest he starve. During this time, he recorded a few instances particularly telling of London's dire situation. This was the most striking thing, the general heartlessness exhibited on every hand. It is a commonplace, the homeless on the benches, the poor miserable folk who may be teased and are harmless. 50,000 people must have passed the bench while I sat upon it, and not one, on such a jubilee occasion as the crowning of the king, felt his heartstrings touched sufficiently to come up and say to a destitute woman, "Here's sixpence. Go and get a bed." But the women, especially the young women, made witty remarks upon the homeless woman nodding off, and invariably set their companions laughing. It was, perhaps, the legal system which kept the poor trapped in destitution. Fresh in my mind is the picture of a boy in the dock of an East End police court. His head was barely visible above the railing. He was being proved guilty of stealing 2 shillings from a woman, which he had spent not for candy and cakes and a good time, but for food. "Why didn't you ask the woman for food?" the magistrate demanded, in a hurt sort of tone. "She would surely have given you something to eat." "If I'd asked her, I'd have got locked up for a begging," was the boy's reply. The magistrate knitted his brows and accepted the rebuke. Nobody knew the boy, nor his father or mother. He was without beginning or antecedent, a waif, a stray, a young cub seeking his food in the jungle of empire, preying upon the weak and being preyed upon by the strong. Even suicide was no way out. A young boy of about 20 appeared in the dock. Alfred Freeman, I caught his name, but failed to catch a charge. A stout and motherly-looking woman bobbed up in the witness box and began her testimony. Time, night. A splash. She ran to the lock and found the prisoner in the water. So that was the charge. Self-murder. He stood there, dazed and unheeding, his bonny brown hair rumpled down his forehead, his face haggard and careworn. and boyish still. "Yes, sir," the woman was saying. "As fast as I pulled to get him out, he crawled right back, and then I called for help, and some workmen happened along, and we got him out and turned him over to the constable." The magistrate complimented the woman on her muscular powers, and the courtroom laughed, but all I could see was a boy on the threshold of life, passionately crawling to muddy death. And there was no laughter in it. A man was now in the witness box, testifying to the boy's good character and giving extenuating evidence. He was the boy's foreman, or had been. Alfred was a good boy, but he had had lots of trouble at home, money matters, and then his mother was sick. He was given to worrying, and he worried over till he laid himself out and wasn't fit for work. The foreman, for the sake of his own reputation, the boy's work being bad, had been forced to ask him to resign. "Anything to say?" the magistrate demanded abruptly. The boy in the dock mumbled something indistinctly. He was still dazed. "What does he say, constable?" the magistrate asked impatiently. The stalwart man in blue bent his ear to the prisoner's lips, and then replied loudly, "He says he's very sorry, your worship." "Remanded," said his worship, and the next case was underway, the first witness already engaged in taking the oath. The boy, dazed and unheeding, passed out with the jailer. That was all. 5 minutes from start to finish, and 2 hulking brutes in the dock were trying strenuously to shift the responsibility of the possession of a stolen fishing pole, worth probably 10 cents. All in all, Jack found it difficult to describe many of his experiences in London's slums. It's clear that it affected him deeply, and he needed time afterwards to recuperate. He never truly got over his experience. He leaves us with this remark in his exposé, "The people of the abyss." "It is rather hard to tell a tithe of what I saw. Much of it is untellable. But in a general way, I may say that I saw a nightmare, a fearful slime that quickened the pavement with life, a mess of unmentionable obscenity that put into eclipse the nightly horror of Piccadilly and the Strand. It was a menagerie of garmented bipeds that looked something like humans and more like beasts, and to complete the picture, brass-buttoned keepers kept order among them when they snarled too fiercely." The book was a smash hit in America, but received a frosty reception in England. The mirror Jack had held up outraged many a wealthy London family. Official statistics illustrated little of the actual deprivation over 1 million Londoners suffered, and either through willful ignorance or genuine unawareness, the government seemed to have little knowledge of the issue's true scale. Real change only began to happen once the government became aware that the chronically malnourished and stunted men of the urban poor were not fit to serve as soldiers. After a royal commission into the Boer War was launched in 1903, General Kelly Kenny reported that the British soldiers from cities were found to be significantly physically deficient when compared to their European counterpart. He stated, "The recruits come from a class who have not had the advantage, as a rule, of good food in their childhood, of careful bringing up, careful nursing, and doctoring, and so on." That was the roughly 60% of men considered fit enough to join in the first place. The remaining 40% were too disabled from poverty to even meet this deficient standard. Those were the stories and voices from East London, as recorded by Jack London in August 1902. But what do you think? Were you aware of the extent of London's poverty at the turn of the 20th century? To what extent do you think the law was responsible for keeping people trapped in poverty? Could you have survived? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks again for watching this video, folks. If you'd like to read more about the people, places and events I've talked about, check out the references in the description. Also, if you've got an idea or a story to share, I'd love to read about it in the comments. If you like this kind of content, hit the subscribe button or pledge your support on Ko-fi. It really does mean a lot. I look forward to reading your thoughts, as it's my favourite part of making these videos by a long way. And I hope these voices have given you something to think about, and I'll see you in the next one.